There is a story they tell in certain rooms. Not loudly, not with ceremony. It gets passed quietly, the way things pass that are too strange to announce and too true to forget. It moves from one person to the next like a low sound beneath conversation, something you almost didn't hear, something you almost didn't believe. And the strange part is nothing happened in this story. No one threw a punch, no one raised their voice, no one walked away with a bruise or a wound or a visible mark. The room stayed exactly as it was. The air stayed still. The people in it went home the same way they arrived. And yet, everyone who was there remembers it. Not the words, not the exact sequence of events, not even all the faces. They remember the feeling, the way something changed without anything moving, the way a person came apart without being touched, the way confidence, real confidence, the kind that fills a room when it walks in quietly and completely unraveled, not because someone attacked it, but because someone simply did not acknowledge it. That is the story. It doesn't have a dramatic climax. It doesn't end with someone on the floor. It ends with a man finishing his sentence and finding, somewhere between the first word and the last, that he no longer meant it the way he started. And the only reason any of it happened was because one person in that room decided, without announcement, without effort, without even the hint of intention, not to react. That person was Bruce Lee. And what follows is what happened. The man speaking was not a small man, not in the physical sense, and not in any other sense either. He carried himself with the kind of ease that only comes from years of being listened to. His voice was controlled. His posture was relaxed. His hands moved when they needed to, punctuating thought rather than filling silence, which is the mark of someone who has never been uncomfortable in front of an audience. He had walked into the room the way men walk in when they already know where they're going to stand, not looking around, not adjusting. He found his position, and he claimed it the way people claim space they've always felt was theirs. The room had other people in it, not a crowd, but enough. A handful of men seated, a few standing near the edges. The light was ordinary. The sounds outside were distant. There was no reason, at the start, to expect anything other than an ordinary exchange. The man began speaking. His subject was technique. It was always technique with men like this. Technique was where they felt safest, because technique is measurable, and measurable things are defensible. He spoke about movement, about the body's natural mechanics, about angles and pressure and the logic of efficiency. His sentences were well built. His pauses were considered. He was not rambling. He was not performing. He was doing what he did when he was most confident, explaining something he believed he understood completely, and it was good. There was no question about that. What he was saying was measured and clear and grounded in real experience. He had lived inside these ideas. You could hear that. The way certain words came out slightly faster than others, the way his rhythm changed almost imperceptibly when he reached something he found genuinely interesting, these were not the signs of a man reciting. They were the signs of a man who had thought carefully and arrived at conclusions he trusted. He expected engagement, not agreement necessarily. He was comfortable with pushback. In fact, pushback was something he handled well, because pushback has shape, and shape is something you can work with. You can address an objection. You can redirect a challenge. You can absorb a counter-argument and fold it into your own point, emerging more assured than when you started. He had done this many times. What he wanted, what every person who speaks with this kind of confidence wants, even if they could never say so directly, was to be met. He wanted someone in the room to be listening in a particular way, not just hearing the words, but tracking them, engaging with them, responding to them even in silence, with the small signals that tell a speaker they are present, a slight lean forward, a change in expression, A nod that isn't agreement but acknowledgement. The language of attention. He continued. His voice moved through the room cleanly, and Bruce Lee sat still. He was not sitting far away. That would have made it easier. Distance creates its own kind of absence, and absence at a distance can be forgiven, attributed to preoccupation or distraction, or simply not being close enough to engage. But Bruce Lee was close. He was within easy line of sight. He was positioned in the room in such a way that the man speaking, if he looked, and he would look, would have a clear and unambiguous view of him. He sat the way some people sit when they have nowhere to be and nothing to prove. There was no tension in it, no deliberate stillness of the kind that announces itself. It was simply the posture of someone who was present without needing to demonstrate that they were present. His eyes were open. His expression was neutral. Not blank. There is a difference between blank and neutral, and Bruce Lee's face was never blank. Blank is the absence of something. What was on his face was more like the surface of still water, containing depth, holding everything, showing nothing. He was watching the man speak. But he was not watching in the way that feeds a speaker. He was watching in the way that a painter watches a subject, receiving, not responding. The man continued speaking. He covered the first layer of his argument with the confidence of someone who has laid this particular foundation many times before. He moved naturally from premise to illustration, from observation to conclusion. His cadence was even. His volume was appropriate. He gave the room no reason to feel anything other than what he clearly intended: respect for the speaker, interest in the content, anticipation of what came next. And somewhere in the construction of his second point, something very small happened. He glanced at Bruce Lee. It was not a long look. It was the kind of look that barely qualifies as a look at all, a quick directional shift of the eyes, the kind that happens automatically when you're speaking in a group and your attention moves around the room out of habit. Nothing deliberate, nothing meaningful on the surface, but it registered, because what he found when he looked was nothing. Not hostility, not boredom, not skepticism, nothing. No signal, no acknowledgement, no small gift of attention that a speaker collects from the room to keep moving. Just a face that held no information about what it was receiving. He continued. The second point was slightly longer than it needed to be. This is how it begins. Not with a stumble, not with a pause long enough to notice, just a subtle expansion. A sentence that could have ended decides not to. An idea that was complete gets one more phrase attached to it, as if it needed reinforcement that it didn't actually need. It is the equivalent of saying something, and then, in the silence after, saying it again slightly differently, not because it wasn't understood the first time, but because the lack of response creates a pressure that the words try to fill. He didn't know he was doing it. That is almost always the case. The men who are most skilled at speaking are often the last to notice when their speech starts working against them, because skill creates confidence, and confidence creates a delay between action and self-observation. They continue doing what they've always done, because what they've always done has always worked. And so the small signs of erosion don't register immediately. He moved into his third point. This one he delivered with a slight increase in precision. Not volume, he was too experienced for that. Precision. The kind that appears when someone unconsciously decides that if they just articulate the idea more clearly, more exactly, more completely, the room will respond in the way they expect. He was not speaking louder. He was speaking more carefully. And this, to anyone watching closely, was the first visible sign. Bruce Lee did not move. His breathing was even. His posture had not shifted. His eyes were still open and still resting with that particular quality of neutrality that is not coldness. Coldness is a temperature, and this was not cold, but simply the absence of the usual currency of social engagement. No validation, no signal, nothing returned. The man speaking reached a natural pause in his third point. A brief structural moment, the kind that a speaker uses to let an idea settle before building on it. A moment that, in ordinary exchanges, would be softened by some small response from the room. An exhale, a murmur, a nod. The pause extended by approximately 2 seconds past where it was supposed to end. He filled it himself with a continuation that had not been part of the original sequence. He was explaining something that didn't need explaining. There is a specific kind of discomfort that has no clear source. Physical discomfort has an origin you can locate. Emotional discomfort usually has a cause you can identify. Social discomfort, the ordinary kind, comes from visible things. A question that was too personal, a silence that went on too long, a room that turned its attention somewhere uncomfortable. But this discomfort was different. This discomfort came from nothing being wrong. Nothing was wrong. No one had said anything. No one had done anything. The room was the same room it had been at the start. The man speaking was still speaking. The content was still solid. The structure was still sound. And yet, something was shifting. The shift was not in the room itself, because the room had not changed. It was not in the other people, because they had not moved or spoken or done anything that would account for the change in atmosphere that was beginning, almost imperceptibly, to develop. The shift was in the speaker, and the cause, the single, simple, structurally complete cause, was that one person in the room had not reacted. That is all. That is the entire mechanism. One person, present and attentive and alive in all the ordinary ways that a person is alive, sitting a moderate distance away, visible and within clear line of sight, simply not reacting, not hostile, not dismissive, not skeptical, not anything. And the absence of anything, when you are in the middle of something, when you have invested your voice and your reasoning and your confidence in the act of being heard, the absence of anything is not neutral. It is enormous. It is enormous in the way that a sound is enormous when it stops suddenly in a room that had been full of it. It is enormous the way an expected step is enormous when the ground isn't there and your foot finds air instead. It is the enormity of a gap where there was supposed to be substance. The man speaking was beginning to feel this. He did not know he was feeling it yet. But his body knew. His hands moved slightly more than they had in the first part of what he was saying. Not dramatically, not in a way that would catch anyone's eye unless they were already watching carefully. But they moved. The gestures that had been economical, precisely placed, deliberate, contained, were becoming slightly larger, slightly more frequent, as if the body, finding that its words were not landing with the traction it expected, was deploying additional tools to fill the space. His left hand had been resting on his knee for the first several minutes. It was no longer resting there. His voice had not changed in volume, but it had changed in something harder to name. There was a quality to it now, a slight increase in what could only be described as effort, a quality that appears when a person begins speaking not from the surface where confidence lives, but from slightly below it, from the layer underneath where the work of maintaining confidence happens. He was working. He had not been working at the start. He reached the point in his argument where he returned to his original premise to close the loop. This is a technique that speakers use when they are in control of the room. It is a demonstration of structural mastery, a way of showing that the journey had a destination. He had clearly used it before. It came out with the ease of something practiced, but his eyes moved to Bruce Lee's face before the sentence was finished. Not after. Before, as if looking for something to land on before he let the sentence end, as if the conclusion of the sentence required something from outside itself to complete it. What he found was the same thing he had found every time he'd looked. Nothing. No validation, no reception, no small quiet confirmation that the journey had been worth taking. Just a phage, holding its expression. Still, the room had been gradually, collectively, impossibly, quietly changing, not moving, not speaking, not doing anything that could be pointed to and named as a change. But the quality of the room's attention had altered. The people sitting at the edges had become more still, not more attentive in the way that attentiveness is usually expressed, by leaning forward or turning the head, but more still in the way that people go, still when they are waiting for something and they don't fully know what. The silence that existed between the speaker's sentences was the same silence it had always been, measured in the same seconds, filled with the same absence of sound. But it had weight now that it hadn't had before. Silence acquires weight when something is accumulating inside it, when the space between words is being used by the room to feel the presence of something no one is naming. What no one was naming was, he's losing it. Not his composure. Exactly. Not his argument. Not his voice. He still had all of those things, but there is something beyond composure, beyond argument, beyond the mechanics of a good performance. There is the thing that makes those mechanics feel effortless rather than effortful. The thing that makes the room believe, without needing to analyze why they believe it, that the person speaking is exactly where they are supposed to be. That thing, that was what was slowly and quietly and absolutely vacating the room. And it was vacating the room because the person whose reaction would have confirmed it had not reacted. That is the only reason. That is the complete explanation. The rest of the room couldn't have produced the effect on their own. They were not doing anything actively. They were not withdrawing their attention or signaling doubt or shifting their posture in ways that communicated skepticism. They were simply watching. The effect wasn't coming from them. It was coming from the gap where Bruce Lee's reaction should have been. The speaker repeated a phrase he had used 20 minutes earlier, not as a callback, not deliberately. He repeated it the way people repeat themselves when they are not sure the idea has settled, when the ground under a thought feels less solid than it should, and instinct reaches for something familiar, something that had felt sure the first time, as if returning to it will restore the certainty that has started to drain from the present moment. He did not hear himself do it. Bruce Lee did not move. The word that describes what was happening to the speaker's voice is not a loud word. It's not dramatic. It fits inside an ordinary sentence without drawing attention to itself. The word is uneven. His voice had become slightly uneven. Not in the way that voices become uneven when someone is upset or frightened or making a mistake they know they're making. Not in any way that the average listener would catch on a single pass. But in the way that voices become uneven when the internal rhythm that produces language, the rhythm that lives below thought, that turns ideas into sentences without requiring active management, begins to require active management. He was now choosing words. At the start, words had been arriving. That is the difference. Words arrive when the mechanism is running without resistance. Words are chosen when resistance is present, and the mechanism has slowed enough that each piece must be selected and placed deliberately. He was placing words. And the placing of words, however skillfully it is done, is always slightly visible. Not visible enough, in most rooms, for most conversations, to matter, but visible enough, in this room, in this particular silence, with this particular gap existing in the exact place where reaction should have been, for something to notice it without naming it. The something was the room. The room noticed, still silently, still without movement or acknowledgement or any visible sign of noticing. But there is a quality of group attention that changes when a room is no longer simply watching, but watching and knowing something is happening that may not have a clean ending. The quality of the room had changed. The speaker reached the final section of what he had planned to say. He had said this section before, in other rooms, and it had always carried a particular weight when it arrived, the weight of a conclusion that has earned itself. The weight of the last movement of something that has been building with intention. He began it, and as he began it, you could hear not in the content, which was correct, which was exactly what it had always been, but in the space between one word and the next, a fraction of a second longer than it needed to be. A breath, not a dramatic breath, not the breath of someone who is struggling, just a breath slightly more visible than the moment called for. As if he needed it, as if the sentence required more than it used to. Bruce Lee's expression did not change. There is a concept in physics about resonance. When you strike something, a string, a bell, a beam of metal, it vibrates at a particular frequency, and if something nearby shares that frequency, it begins to vibrate too, without being touched. The vibration passes through the air and finds its match and sets it moving. This is resonance. It is the mechanism by which one thing in motion causes another thing to move without direct contact. There is something similar that happens in rooms between people. When a speaker is confident, when the internal state that produces confidence is running cleanly and producing its effect, it creates something like a frequency. A quality of presence that moves through the room and finds the receiving surfaces, the attention of the people watching, the posture of the people listening, and produces in them a kind of matching state, not identical, but sympathetic. The room attunes itself, gently and without deliberation, to the state of the person speaking. This is what confidence actually does in a room, not command, not dominate. Attune, and the mechanism that enables this works in both directions. When the speaker's internal state begins to shift, the room feels it before the speaker does, before the words change, before the posture changes, before anything visible happens. The frequency shifts, the resonance changes. The room, which had been attuning itself to one quality, begins to feel a different quality arriving, or more precisely, begins to feel the previous quality diminishing, becoming less certain, requiring more support from beneath itself to maintain its surface. The room was feeling this now, not with understanding, not with analysis, not with any of the language that would be required to explain it afterward, just with the particular attentiveness that bodies bring to moments when something is in the process of changing. The speaker's voice was still carrying the argument. The logic was intact. The sequence was correct. The conclusion, which he was approaching, was exactly the conclusion it had always been. But the room was not receiving it with the weight it had always carried before, because the room was no longer purely listening. The room was watching, and what it was watching, without knowing it was watching it, was the slow and quiet and entirely invisible effort of a man trying to hold together something that was coming apart at a frequency too low to hear. Bruce Lee had not moved. His hands. Let's return to his hands, because his hands are where it was showing most clearly now. They were too active, not wildly, not in a way that looked wrong on its own, isolated from context, but against the memory of how they had been at the start of this conversation, contained, purposeful, arriving when they were needed and returning when they were not, against that memory. They were too active. They were doing the work his voice was slightly struggling to do. They were filling, not intentionally. The hands don't decide to fill, they simply respond to the need. They respond the way water responds to a low place, without decision, without intention, simply by following the shape of what's available. The available shape was space, space that should have been filled by a response that hadn't come. The hands were moving into it, He gestured on a phrase that didn't require gesture. He held the gesture half a second longer than the phrase lasted. He moved his weight forward, slightly, on the word that should have been the anchor of his final point, not leaning toward Bruce Lee. Leaning toward the room, the way people lean toward a flame when the warmth isn't quite reaching them and the instinct is to close the distance. His voice held the last major point for a fraction of a beat, longer than the point required, as if giving the room time to receive it, as if checking, as if testing whether it had landed. Somewhere in the last quarter of what he was saying, his voice had moved from assertion to something that still sounded like assertion, but functioned more like proposal. The surface was the same, the confidence in the words was still there, but confidence in the delivery of words and confidence in the reception of those words are different things, and the second one had begun to tilt. He was no longer stating, he was offering, and offering requires a response, which did not come. Bruce Lee sat completely still. The quality of his stillness was remarkable in the way that certain unremarkable things are remarkable only when you look at them for long enough. He was simply a man sitting in a room. He was doing nothing that could be described in terms that would make it sound like anything other than sitting in a room. His eyes were open, his hands were resting. His face held the expression it had held from the beginning. No curiosity, no boredom, no suppressed amusement or hidden skepticism or quiet interest, or any of the 1,000 small flags that human faces fly to tell the people watching them what is happening inside. Just a face, present and open, and receiving everything and returning nothing, like a window that lets the light in and gives nothing back. There is a moment in every conversation that is going wrong not through conflict or misunderstanding or any visible failure, but simply through the quiet and relentless absence of what was expected. There is a moment in every such conversation where the person inside it makes a choice. The choice is not conscious. It does not feel like a choice. It feels like what comes next. It feels inevitable and organic, and like the only available option. The choice is this: stop trying to make the thing happen that isn't happening, or try harder to make it happen. Almost everyone tries harder. This is not weakness. This is not failure of self-awareness. This is the deeply human response to a stimulus that is not providing the expected feedback. You adjust. You modify your approach. You bring more resources to bear. You increase the signal because the signal doesn't seem to be getting through. He tried harder. His voice found more precision. Not more volume, not more speed, but more deliberate placement of emphasis, more careful architecture of sentence stress, more visible effort to make the important things feel important, and the connecting tissue feel transparent, and the conclusion feel inevitable. It was technically excellent. It was, in certain ways, better than what had come before. And it was unmistakably the sound of a man working. A man who had not been working before was now working. And working, even excellent working, even working that no one who hadn't been watching from the beginning would recognize as working. Working reads as effort, and effort reads as the presence of something that requires effort. And the thing that requires effort in a conversation is uncertainty. He was certain. He was trying to be certain. These are not the same thing. The room held. Someone near the back shifted, not significantly. A small adjustment of position, the kind that happens dozens of times a day without meaning anything. But it happened now, in this particular silence, and it had a quality of subtle unanchoring, as if the person making it was responding to something in the air that had made their current position feel slightly less permanent. Nothing was said. Nothing was indicated. Bruce Lee did not change. The final section of what the man was saying had arrived. It arrived the way final sections arrive in rooms where things have not gone as planned. Slightly early, slightly abruptly, as if the speaker's internal clock has accelerated to close the distance between where they are and where this ends. Not rushing, not obviously hurrying, but moving toward the exit with a directness that was not present in the earlier parts. He was finishing, and as he finished, something became visible that had been present for several minutes without showing itself on the surface. He was not going to reach the place he had set out to reach, not because his argument had failed, not because someone had challenged him, not because the words had stopped, or the logic had broken, or the room had turned against him. None of those things had happened. He was not going to reach the place he had set out to reach because the place he had set out to reach required something from outside himself that had not been supplied. The place he had set out to reach was certainty in the presence of another person's recognition. That is a very specific place, and you can construct the most careful and correct and fully supported road to it, and you can walk that road with complete attention and real skill, and if the person whose recognition is the destination simply does not give it, the road goes nowhere. Not backward, nowhere. It simply ends in a space that is neither arrival nor return. He finished his last sentence. It was grammatically complete. The idea was intact. The conclusion was exactly what it had always been. But when the final word left the air, the silence that followed was not the silence of a room absorbing something. It was not the silence of a point landing. It was the silence of a room that had been waiting for something to end and had now watched it end and was settling back into itself, returning to the weight of its own quiet. The kind of silence that doesn't echo, the kind that doesn't give anything back. For a moment, he stood in what he had said. This is what people do when they finish speaking in a room. They stand briefly in the last sentence, inhabiting it, letting it settle. It is the pause before the response, the breath before the room shifts. But the breath extended, and the room did not shift in the way that rooms shift after something has been received. He looked at Bruce Lee, not quickly this time, not the brief automatic glance of a speaker scanning his audience. He looked directly, with the fullness of someone who is, for the first time in the conversation, allowing themselves to look directly rather than incidentally. And what he found was exactly what he had always found. A face, open, still, present, containing nothing that could be read. No approval, no disagreement, no recognition, no assessment, no acknowledgement that what had just happened had happened at all. It was the same face it had been at the beginning, unchanged, as if the entire preceding half hour had passed against a surface that registered it and retained nothing of it. As if the effort and the precision and the carefully constructed argument and all the small adjustments and compensations that had accumulated like layers of paint over the original confidence had simply been received and dissolved into a stillness that had never once moved in response. He looked away, not dramatically, not with any visible expression of defeat or frustration or recognition of what had just occurred. He simply looked away in the easy, casual way that people look away when they are done looking at something. But his hands had stopped moving, and his weight had settled back, and the quality of his presence in the room, which had arrived so fully and claimed its space so naturally, that quality had undergone a change that did not have a simple name. It was present, but differently, as if something in it had been redistributed, as if the forward momentum of it, the reaching toward quality of it, had been quietly and completely withdrawn. He was still there, but less toward, less forward, less certain of its welcome in the space it had been occupying. Bruce Lee sat in exactly the position he had held from the beginning. The room began to do the small and quiet things that rooms do after something has passed. Someone cleared their throat. The sound was brief and inconsequential and carried, despite itself, the quality of a person returning to normal breathing after holding their breath without knowing they were holding it. Someone else moved their feet, crossing one ankle over the other, the simple domestic gesture of a body reasserting its comfort after a period of particular attentiveness. Voices returned, not loudly, not with the sudden release of a held thing, but with the gradual and natural easing of a room that is no longer pointed in any particular direction. The conversation shifted, the way conversations shift, by becoming about nothing and everything at once, by dissolving back into the medium of ordinary exchange from which it had briefly and tensely separated itself. And in the shifting of it, in the dissolving of the particular quality that had accumulated over the preceding half hour, there was no acknowledgement. No one said anything about what had happened. No one named it. No one looked at anyone else in the particular way that people look at each other after a significant shared experience when they want to confirm that the other person felt it too. Nothing was said. Nothing was indicated. Nothing was agreed upon. But every person in that room carried it. They carried it the way you carry a sound you heard in a corridor late at night that you cannot place and cannot explain, and that your body holds long after your mind has moved on. The man who had spoken was talking again, but about something smaller now, something casual, the conversational texture of a person who has finished the serious thing and returned to the ordinary thing, as if the ordinary thing is what he had come for. His voice was easy. His posture was easy. Everything about him, on the surface, was easy. But if you were watching the distance he kept from where he had been standing, if you were watching the amount of space he claimed as his own now versus the amount he had claimed when he walked in, if you were watching the reach and forward quality of his presence against what it had been, you would notice. You would not be able to say exactly what you noticed, but you would notice. Bruce Lee was still in the room, still sitting in the same position, still holding the same expression, still present in the particular way that he had been present from the beginning, which was the way of a person who is completely there and not participating in the social negotiation that being completely there usually involves. Most people, when they are in a room, are in a negotiation. They are negotiating attention, negotiating acknowledgement, negotiating the amount of space they take versus the amount of space they give. They are managing the exchange of social currency that keeps the room in a kind of collective equilibrium, giving enough to be considered present and engaged, receiving enough to feel that their presence is registering, adjusting constantly to maintain the balance that makes a room feel like a shared space rather than a collection of separate people occupying the same location. Bruce Lee was not in that negotiation. He was simply there, not outside the social world of the room, not cold to it, not immune to it, or contemptuous of it. Just not inside the transactional aspect of it. Just present. Just watching. Just receiving what the room produced and returning nothing that was not exactly what he intended to return. And in the gap between what he received and what he returned, the entire event had occurred. In the gap, in the nothing, in the space where a reaction should have been and wasn't. The man who had spoken was nodding at something someone else was saying now. His nod was natural. His face was at ease. His eyes were in the ordinary mid-distance of someone, in a light conversation. But occasionally, not often, not desperately, but occasionally his eyes moved toward Bruce Lee, and each time they moved there, they found the same thing, the same face, the same stillness, the same absence of the signal they were, without fully knowing it, looking for. And each time they looked and found it, something very small registered, not in his expression, not in any way a camera would capture, but in the microscopic adjustments that bodies make when they encounter a thing they cannot resolve. And then they looked away again, back to the light conversation, back to the easy voice, back to the surface of things. Bruce Lee sat still. The room settled. The light was the same light. The sounds outside were the same sounds. Everything was exactly as it had been, and completely different. Let's slow down here. Let's stay in this room a little longer than the story requires, because what happened here is not the kind of thing that announces itself. It is not the kind of thing that shows up in the accounts afterward with its full weight visible. What happened here is the kind of thing that people describe later as a feeling, and when pressed for specifics, find themselves unable to say what, exactly, the feeling was about. He said something. Bruce Lee didn't really respond, and somehow everything changed. That's the version. That's all most people will be able to give you. But the something is everything here. The something is the whole architecture of what human beings need from each other in order to function as themselves. The something is the mechanism by which we stabilize our own sense of reality by watching it received by another person. The something is the reason we look at faces when we finish saying something important, not because the face will tell us whether the something was true, but because the face will tell us whether we were there when we said it. This is a strange thing to say, but it is true. We need the other person's face to confirm that we exist inside our own experience. Not that the experience is valid, not that the opinion is correct, not that the argument is sound, just that we are here, that the thing we are doing is happening, that there is a there. When the face returns nothing, the confirmation doesn't arrive. And when the confirmation doesn't arrive, something very quiet and very fundamental begins to happen. The speaker begins to double-check their own experience against itself. They begin to generate, internally, the question they would not consciously acknowledge. Did I say that? Did I say it well? Did I say what I meant? Is the thing I think I'm doing the thing I'm actually doing? These are not the questions of someone who has been challenged. These are the questions of someone who has been removed from the ground. Challenge gives you something to stand on. Even resistance is a surface. Even disagreement is a kind of engagement that tells you where you are in relation to the world around you. You know where the challenge is coming from. You know how to meet it. You have the coordinates of the exchange. But when a person simply does not react, there are no coordinates. There is no information about where you are in relation to them. And without that information, you are navigating without reference. You are speaking into a void that looks like a person. You are receiving back exactly what you put in, which is nothing, because you put in words, and the word for nothing is silence. And silence, held long enough, in a face that is close enough to see clearly, becomes the most destabilizing thing in a room. Not because of what it says, because of what it refuses to say. Because it refuses to say anything at all. He was a capable man. Let this be said clearly, because the rest of this carries a weight that can be misread, and that weight should not distort this. He was capable. He was intelligent. He had skill that he had earned through real work and real time and real attention paid to something that mattered to him. The things he said were not empty. The things he said were not wrong. This is important, because what happened to him in this room was not the exposure of some failure. It was not the unmasking of false confidence or the collapse of a facade built on nothing. He was not pretending, he was real. And what Bruce Lee's silence did to him was not correct him, it was not evaluate him, it was not pass judgment on the truth or value or merit of what he was saying. What Bruce Lee's silence did was simply this: remove the external scaffold. Every person who speaks with confidence in a room is, to some degree, using the room as a scaffold. They are using the attention of others, the responsiveness of others, the small continuous signals of engagement that others provide, as a structure they build their confidence against. Not because the confidence isn't real, but because confidence in a room is always a collaborative project, even when it looks entirely like a solo one. The speaker builds. The room receives. The receiving enables the building. The building produces the receiving. The system reinforces itself. When one part of the system stops functioning, the system does not collapse immediately. That would be easier. It would be visible and finite, and it would have a resolution. It or this, slowly, without announcement, without a clear point of origin or a clear trajectory of failure. Just a quiet, persistent, very small subtraction from the quality of the confidence being maintained, happening at the exact rate that the missing feedback would have replenished it, so that the net effect is like a container with a hole at the bottom. It still holds what it holds, but it is no longer full. He had come into the room full. He had been draining, very slowly, since the first moment. He looked at Bruce Lee's face and found nothing in it. And by the time he reached the end of what he was saying, he was not empty. He was not close to empty. But he was measurably, undeniably, significantly less full than he had been. And the room had felt it. And he had felt the room feeling it. And the two things had fed each other in the wrong direction. And none of it required anything other than silence. Silence. It's worth sitting with this word. We treat silence as a negative, as an absence, as the thing that is left when sound stops. We describe silence in terms of what it isn't. Not loud, not filled, not responsive, not alive with the back and forth that we use to measure aliveness. But silence in a room between people is not empty. Silence between people is full. It is full of what is not being said, which is always more than what is being said. It is full of what is not being responded to, which registers against the expectation of response with a weight proportional to how strongly the response was expected. It is full of what is not being confirmed, which accumulates like pressure in a system that was designed to release it. Silence in a room between a person who is speaking and a person who is not responding is one of the most information-dense things that can exist in that space. It is dense with the absence of validation. It is dense with the absence of engagement. It is dense with the absence of the small and continuous generosity that human beings extend to each other in conversation simply by being visible in their listening. And this density, this enormous, quiet, completely invisible density, acts on the person speaking the way gravity acts on a structure, not by hitting it, not by attacking it, simply by being present and persistent and impossible to negotiate with. Gravity doesn't attack a building, it simply is. And the building, over time, adjusts to accommodate it. He was adjusting. He had been adjusting since almost the beginning. And the adjustment, visible only to those watching closely, and only in retrospect even to them, was the shape of a man moving from the architecture of confidence to the architecture of maintenance. One stands up straight because it is natural to stand up straight. The other stands up straight because it is necessary to stand up straight. They look the same from a distance. They feel entirely different from inside. He was feeling it. Bruce Lee sat still. What does it cost? What does it cost to sit still in a room and give nothing back? This is the question that eventually arrives whenever this story is told, or whenever this pattern of behavior is observed, or whenever someone comes across a person in their own life who has, whether intentionally or not, this particular quality of non-reaction, this particular refusal to participate in the normal economy of social acknowledgement. What does it cost? The answer is, it costs nothing. This is the disturbing part. It costs absolutely nothing to simply be present and attentive and completely unresponsive in the social currency sense. It requires no special training. It requires no extraordinary self-discipline, no painful suppression of natural instincts, no effort in any direction. It does not require you to do something difficult. It requires you to not do something easy. The easy thing is responding. Responding is the default. Responding is what happens automatically when the system is running normally. The nod, the slight expression change, the small repositioning of the body that signals to the speaker that the signal has been received, these are not choices. They are defaults. They are what happen when nothing is interfering with the natural operation of social attunement. What Bruce Lee was doing was not an act of deliberate cruelty or manipulation or power. It was not strategy in any scheming sense of the word. It was the quiet removal of a default. And the removal of a default that the other person was relying on without knowing they were relying on it, which is the nature of defaults. You don't notice them until they stop the removal of that default produced quietly and steadily and without any apparent effort on the part of the person doing it, an effect so significant that everyone in the room felt it, and that the man at the center of it is still, in some version of this story, at some level still trying to account for. He doesn't know exactly what happened. He knows something happened. He knows it had to do with Bruce Lee. He cannot fully explain what Bruce Lee did, because from the outside, from any accountable, describable, nameable perspective, Bruce Lee did nothing. And that is the answer. That is the whole answer. Nothing. Nothing is what it takes. Nothing is what it costs. And nothing is what it leaves behind in the person on the receiving end of it, not emptiness, but the very specific and very difficult experience of having tried to fill a space that kept its shape regardless of what was put into it. He tried to fill the space. The space did not fill. He left the room the same man he had been when he entered it. But he did not leave the room the same way. Months later, in a different conversation, someone asked him about that afternoon, not directly, not naming it, just in the course of talking about other things. Someone mentioned the gathering, mentioned the room, mentioned who had been there. He was quiet for a moment. He said, "Something was different about that room." He was not asked to elaborate. He did not elaborate. But something in the way he said it, the particular quality of the pause before it, the particular quality of the voice during it, communicated that the something was large, and that it had stayed large, and that it had never been resolved into an explanation he was comfortable with. Something was different about that room. The something was Bruce Lee's face. The something was the absence on that face of what faces normally give. The something was the way that absence had accumulated over the course of 40 minutes, from a small and barely noticeable thing into something so heavy it had changed the center of gravity in the room. The something was nothing. It was always nothing. It will always be nothing. And nothing, held by the right person in the right room for the right length of time, is everything. Bruce Lee stayed until the end. He did not leave early. He did not remove himself from the room with any of the various kinds of deliberateness that would have made a statement. He stayed. He was present for the entire duration of what happened, from the man's confident entry to his quieter conclusion, from the room's initial ease to its late and unnamed heaviness. He was there for all of it. And being there for all of it, present, open, attentive, completely non-responsive in every social sense, a pure observer in a room full of participants, was the entirety of what he did. He sat in a chair. He held an expression. He watched. He did not react. And the room around him changed. Not toward him, not because of anything external he had done. The room changed the way weather changes, not because of anything the sky does to itself on purpose, but because of conditions that exist and persist and produce effects simply by being what they are. He was a condition. He was a condition that the room had no mechanism for. And when rooms encounter conditions they have no mechanism for, they do not break down in any dramatic or visible way. They continue. The conversations continue. The voices continue. The ordinary business of being in a room with other people continues. But something has moved. Something that was one thing is now a slightly different thing. Something that was certain is now less certain. Something that held its shape easily now requires a little more of itself to hold the same shape. These are not large changes. These are the changes that happen at the level of grain, not at the level of structure. But grain is where everything starts. Grain is where the largest changes begin, quietly, without announcement, long before they reach the surface. Outside, the day continued. The sounds that had been outside during the entire duration of what happened were still outside. Cars moving through ordinary streets, the ambient noise of a city doing its ordinary work, the sky holding its ordinary position above everything, impersonal and complete. Nothing outside the room knew what had happened inside the room. Nothing outside the room had any relationship to what had happened inside the room. The day had no interest in the event. Only the people carried it. Only the people would continue to carry it, in the particular places inside themselves where things settle when they cannot be processed cleanly, when they resist the neat resolutions that allow experiences to file themselves away and stop requiring attention. This one would keep requiring attention, quietly, not all the time, not with any urgency, but in moments of stillness, in moments when the mind returns to unresolved things without being asked to, in the moments between other moments when the work of being conscious relaxes and what's underneath surfaces briefly and wordlessly. In those moments, the man who had spoken in that room would find himself back in it, standing in what he had said, feeling the weight of what had not come back, not understanding why it still weighed what it weighed, not understanding why the face of a man who did nothing could have done so much, not understanding, still not understanding. The room is the same room it was. The light is the same light. Bruce Lee is still sitting there, still not reacting, still giving nothing back. Still,